Video games are a form of entertainment, so it's not unusual for games to be adapted to different mediums like movies or cartoons in order to bring in an audience that probably wouldn't go out and play the games. This happens with anime-style games too, of course, so it's only natural that some of those will end up being made into animes and mangas. There's actually a good amount of anime that started life as games, the most known one being Pokemon, of course. But there's also Disgaea, Senran Kagura, Valkyria Chronicles, Corpse Party, and many more, especially if you count visual novels. I think it would be fun to look at all of those, but in this video we're going to focus specifically on Hyperdimension Neptunia, the animation. We'll see how the Neptunia series made the transition from game to anime, and if it managed to retain the feel or even build upon the source material. We'll start with the basics and plot summary first. Then we'll dive deeper into the details like the art style, animation, the dub, and music, among other things. At the end, I'll go over the story in a bit more detail. You can expect spoilers at that point for both the games and the anime, because I want to talk about some of the differences and similarities, so tread carefully if you're worried. I know a lot of you subscribers don't need a rundown on what Neptunia is all about, but there's always a good amount of new people watching, so I'll explain the basic premise. The basics are that Neptunia is an anthropomorphization of the console wars. The world is called game industry, and there are 4 goddesses that each represent a console. They compete for shares or share energy, which represents real-life market share, but in the series it symbolizes each nation's belief in their goddess. Neptune is the main character out of the 4 goddesses, as you probably already know by now. There's a lot of references to gaming strewn around, and the storylines have an interesting mixture of serious and silly moments. And the main plot is usually about defeating some sort of dark force that is threatening game industry, while at the same time featuring lots of character interactions. The relationships the characters have with each other is actually one of the main appeals of the series. Oh yeah, there's a bit of fan service here and there too. There, I think that was a suitable rundown. David Production is the studio that animated Neptunia the animation, and they're most famous for adapting the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure manga. The anime's original run of 12 episodes was from July 12th to September 27th, 2013, making it part of the summer 2013 lineup, with an additional OVA being released March 2014. Just for some perspective, at that time the first 3 PS3 games were released both in Japan and the West, while the Idol spin-off Producing Perfection was only out in Japan at the time. In other words, this was before the Rebirth remakes and V2 and V2R, so don't expect Uzume to show up or something. The games feature a lot of dialogue, so at the time of the anime's airing, the setting and the character personalities were already well established. I did have moderately high expectations that the show was going to be somewhat true to the source material. And I think yes, Neptunia the animation does a very good job of portraying the different characters and character interactions, as well as fleshing out the setting and world of game industry. It also helps that a lot of the running gags and jokes have been preserved in one way or another. When it comes to anime adaptations of games, I think it's perfectly okay to be liberal with the changes, since the format is so much more different than, say, between mangas and animes. The most important part is to retain the feel of the games, which is what Neptunia the animation does. While the story is unique to the anime, it's very clearly based on Victory, even if only loosely, with specific plot points and references cherry-picked from both Mark II and Victory. The premise is that there's a growing sentiment that goddesses shouldn't exist. And while the enemies the main cast go up against may appear to some as being separate from one another, it all ends up being linked together and part of a greater plan. The story isn't as intricate or detailed as the games can get, but like I said, the overall feel of the games is still there. The only thing I don't like is how certain characters just aren't introduced well, or how you never really learn anything about them as the show goes on. I think this is due to the fact that the anime needs to be quite fast-paced to cover all the major plot points, whereas the games can take their time when it comes to character development and backstory. It's not really a fault in execution in my opinion, but rather just a trait of the medium, if that makes sense. They did nail the characters' personalities though, so that's great. Now let's talk about the art style. The original illustrations are done by Tsuneko, and she's got a really nice and distinctive art style. The anime obviously looks different, but it still looks very good overall. It's certainly much less of a departure than the Valkyria Chronicles anime. I think the visuals are slightly inspired by what Studio Shaft sometimes does. There's a lot of shading and gradients to keep the art from looking flat, and in order to keep the conversations from being visually boring, they sometimes use silhouettes or artistic camera angles. That's how I see it anyway. Not that I think that the show looks like a Shaft anime. Shaft probably would have done something a lot more crazy than that. I also like how they made an effort to retain certain visual elements from the games, like the enemies and even the effects when they're defeated, and how all the different dungeons and nations look. Usually when I look at something, I can recognize it or see where they drew inspiration from. The character designs stay very true to the source material. At least I haven't noticed any errors or anything like that. And off-model moments are quite uncommon. Neptune does have her victory getup for both normal and HDD mode, which isn't really that surprising. All the characters also have their correct clothing and weapons, as well as signature special attacks. Speaking of characters, all the human-looking characters are girls or women. There are no men in sight ever, definitely a reference to the games, which for the longest time made an effort to not provide any character art for male characters. I think the animation is decent. Nothing super fancy, but I feel like it's all above average. The fight scenes are well done and pretty cool to look at. The effects mimic the games like I already mentioned. The only complaint I have is the use of 3D models. It's really obvious at certain points. But still, it's not as bad as something like the Kantai Collection anime where CG was used in all the fight scenes, even when the characters are up close. The sound design is perfectly acceptable. I think the fight scenes have cool effects, but the explosions are way overdone. It's almost like the sample they were using was clipping at its loudest point. It sounds really awful and it bothers me every time I hear it. Everything else was perfectly fine from what I could tell. Speaking of sound, let's talk about the voiceovers. That's always a polarizing topic, whether to use the English or Japanese dub. But it doesn't need to be. Just pick whatever you think sounds best. It's not hard. But there's a few things worth mentioning about the English dub, especially the voice actors. Funimation managed to get most of the original cast from the games, including all the goddesses and the little sisters, which is great. And this is before the departure of Tara Platt and Aaron Fitzgerald, who voice Vert and Noir respectively. I definitely don't mind the current voice actors, but it's nice to have the original voice actors doing the anime. If they didn't, we wouldn't have gotten the legendary Noir scream. But there are some characters who are voiced by different actors, like Iffy, 5PB, Pirachu or Werachu, or whatever the hell his name is now, and Pishi. I think that's all. As someone who watched the subbed version when it first aired, and then the dubbed version now, I personally prefer the dub. I think they managed to add a bunch of hilarious lines. The entire segment leading up to Noir's scream has some great lines from Anonydeath and Neptune.
I may be queer, but let me lay it straight.
In fact, there's usually some very quotable and notable lines in each episode. But sometimes it's not even about the translation, but the right timing and delivery of the lines. Like when Neptune looks behind as she's flying in her HDD form and says,
"It seems like you're a bit distracted."
I think it's a really clever way of showing self-awareness without blatantly breaking the fourth wall. Let's talk about the music now. I think the music is a definite step above average in terms of anime standards. You'll recognize a lot of the tunes from the games, but they're usually reworked and tweaked, which is nice because it doesn't feel like they're just using recycled assets. Unlike a lot of the games, there's a lot of new music too, which I think works very well at establishing the correct mood and feel for the given scene. Now let's talk about the story in a bit more detail, as well as discuss some differences between the games and the show. There's going to be spoilers, so don't watch beyond this point if you're worried about that. It's interesting how the anime handles the story. They could have gone with the approach of the first game and have the conflict between the nations be an integral part of the story, but the first episode actually begins with the goddesses announcing their peace treaty to the people of game industry. There are some moments where it's implied that some of the goddesses could have other motives, but by episode 2, it's made quite clear that the show was actually just tricking you. The little sisters are shown to be friends right away from the start, which isn't exactly the case in Mark II. Despite the main story being mainly based on victory, the show goes through Mark II-inspired plot points first. Ram and Rem get kidnapped by CFW Trick, and after that ordeal, R4 traps the goddesses tentacle style in the game industry graveyard, which I don't think is mentioned by name. Despite those plot points being very familiar, the details are all different. Nepgear isn't trapped at all, and she's got no problems recruiting the little sisters to help, despite Uni saying something pretty terrible to a depressed Nepgear at one point.
I wish they'd capture you instead, because no one would miss you!
But they reconcile and get on with it in the same episode. Another thing that is unlike Mark II is that the CPU candidates can't even transform yet. They only manage to do so while fighting R4 when they reach some sort of enlightenment once they become honest with themselves. After that, Pishi is introduced, which signals the start of the more victory-inspired part of the story. Instead of Neptune ending up in another dimension, it's Pishi and Plutia that make their way over to Neptune's dimension. So we don't get to meet the Ultra Dimension goddesses like in Victory. Well, at least not until the OVA. The reason Plutia ends up in the hyperdimension is because someone traveled to Neptune's dimension and Plutia and the other Histi are trying to figure out who it was. It's very obviously Pishi, but the characters don't know that till later. For the time being, everyone just thinks she's a lost child. Episodes 6 and 7, and also some of episode 8, are kind of breather episodes to allow the viewers to get to know Plutia and Pishi, show development between the characters, and just straight up enjoy some shenanigans. Episode 6 is the one that has the famous noir scream scene when she finds out about Ananideth stalking her. I just like everything about that episode. Like I said earlier, the dub has some really funny lines and voice acting in this one.
Is the awesomest in the whole world. The derp, you got hacked.
Despite some of the unfolding events being important, the episode just doesn't come across as all that serious, which is nice after all the drama from the previous arc. Episode 7 is noteworthy too since it's the eggplant episode. Which anime has an eggplant episode? Neptunia, of course. Again, it's more shenanigans, with R4 trying to lure Neptune to an eggplant farm after overhearing that Neptune's weakness is eggplants. It's funny how quickly she went from villain to comedic relief. It's really difficult to take anything that happens seriously, but I like it. And one of the best parts is when Plutie transforms and ends up scaring everyone with her HDD mode personality. Episode 8 is where things start getting a bit more serious again, despite it being a fan service episode at the same time. The goddesses and Nepgear head to R13 Island to investigate a suspicious gun battery, which leads to some fan service / comedic moments. But before they leave for the island, Pishi and Neptune get into a fight. Before they can apologize to each other, Ray shows up at the Basilicom, posing as Pishi's mother, and effectively kidnaps her with the help of some evil sauce. Here's another notable difference. In Victory, Pishi becomes a CPU by mistake because she eats that thing that turns people into CPUs, whereas in the anime, Pishi was just supposed to be a CPU in the first place, if I understood everything correctly. Pishi, along with a lot of the citizens, are then brainwashed with the evil sauce again, and the whole Eden invasion thing happens. Transformed Pishi turns out to be difficult to deal with, especially since her memories of Neptune and everyone was blocked. But as usual, an emotional scene saves the day, and Pishi and Plutia bugger off back to their dimensions. Then for the finale, Ray gains power by stealing Share energy and reveals that she's the goddess of the long-lost nation of Tari, and basically destroys the world, or wants to anyways. This whole conflict is like 2 episodes long, and I'm not going to describe the entire thing, but I did find it very interesting how R4 of all people saves the day, stating that while she doesn't like the goddesses, she doesn't want the world to be destroyed. How unlike the games, where she actually is trying to destroy the world. After the final episode, there's an OVA, which has a lighthearted feel to it. The episode starts with what looks like the Mark II Conquest ending, but by the time you hear that weird noise Neptune makes when getting hit by Nepgear's sword, you know it's not really a serious moment. It turns out all the little sisters somehow have a sickness called Bad End Syndrome, hence the dream sequence we see. The 4 goddesses go to the Ultra Dimension to find specific flowers that cure the sickness, and they finally get to meet the Ultra Dimension CPUs and reunite with Pishi and Plutia as well. The flowers are located on top of a tower, so the party heads on over to retrieve the flowers.
Wow, that sure was convenient that we found an elevator that goes straight from floor 4 to floor 9,999, and they say cheaters never prosper. Ha!
In the end, they managed to permanently keep the gate between the Hyper and Ultra dimensions open, enabling everyone to move about freely. It's a nice way to end the anime since it allows a nice happy ending, with Neptune and Pishi who finally managed to fight together on the same side instead of against each other. One of the biggest omissions are the lack of side characters, and I'm sure you've noticed if you've played the games. Thankfully, there was Iffy and Compa. 5PB wasn't really part of the story at all, with just 2 appearances, and we only get a very quick glimpse of mages right at the very beginning of the first episode. No Nisa or Gust or any of the other side characters that represent other companies, probably because they already knew about their upcoming removal in Rebirth 1. Plus, it's not like there aren't enough characters already. There are 11 goddesses if you count Pishi and Rei. Cramming more characters in there would have been just too much. You could tell they already struggled to give everyone proper screen time. That's probably also the reason we didn't get all of the 7 sages either. Now, it might sound like I'm criticizing Neptunia the animation for all the omissions and changes compared to the games, but in reality, I really enjoyed it. And while a lot of things had to be simplified just due to the 12-episode constraint, 13 if you count the OVA, there's a lot of how episodes were structured that I really liked. For instance, I like how certain events are portrayed in a serious manner, but then turn out to be not what you expected them to be. Like when Blonde was too busy spending time with her little sisters. It looks like some sort of emotional distance or gap is forming between them, but it turns out Blonde was just working really hard at getting her Dojin novel finished. It's sort of relieving because you want the characters to like each other. It reminds me of how things are in real life. You read too much into something and you start overthinking the situation, but in the end, the answer to the problem is usually something very simple or just a misunderstanding. And the episodes are structured in a way to play with mood like that. Another thing I enjoyed are the clips at the very end of each episode, where they take a serious scene from the episode and make something humorous out of it. Like Iffy accidentally showing everyone a photo of Kompa sleeping, or when Rei handed out some weird drawing that references her Japanese voice actor's bizarre art, instead of her anti-goddesses pamphlet. It's something that's very much in line with the humor in the games, but couldn't really be done outside of an anime. Imagine the games at the end of each chapter having a VN cutscene, doing something similar. It just wouldn't have the same impact. So I think it's great that they managed to really make use of the medium to keep things interesting and funny. Anyway, that's what I think of Hyperdimension Neptunia the animation. I thought it was a lot of fun, and while you do benefit having played the games first because of the numerous references, I think newcomers can still enjoy the anime, and it can even provide a bit of foundation to people who haven't played the main series but want to jump into a spin-off game, for example. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. It's the first time I've done something like this, so I was very unsure of how to structure this video. Let me know what you think of the format, and if you want to see some more game to anime videos. Like the video if you did, subscribe for more upcoming videos, check out Patreon if you want to help out the channel, and also subscribe to the second channel. There you can find archived streams, the occasional raw gameplay video, and some behind the scenes stuff too. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.